4. Start Hour 5. Needed reforms. Increase spending and budget accuracy in line with a threat-based strategy. Returning the U.S. military to a force that can achieve deterrence or win in a fight if necessary requires returning to a threat-based defense strategy. Real budget growth combined with a more equitable distribution of resources across the armed services is the only realistic way to create a modernized Air Force with the capacity to meet the needs of the national defense strategy. Additionally, as noted above, pass-through funding causes numbers cited in current DoD budget documents to be higher than the dollar amounts actually received by the Air Force. 1. Adopt a two-war force defense strategy with scenarios for each service that will allow the Air Force to attain the resources it requires by developing a force sizing construct that reflects what is required to accomplish strategic objectives. 2. Eliminate pass-through funding, which has grown to more than $40 billion per year and has caused the Air Force to be chronically underfunded for decades. 3. Increase the Air Force budget by 5% annually, after adjusting for inflation, to reverse the decline in size, age, and readiness and facilitate the transition to a more modern, lethal, and survivable force. Reduce near-term and mid-term risk. Increasing the Air Force's acquisition of next-generation capabilities that either are or soon will be in production will increase the ability of the United States to deter or defeat near-term to mid-term threats. 1. Increase F-35A procurement to 60 to 80 per year. 2. Build the capacity for a B-21 production rate of 15 to 18 aircraft per year along with applicable elements of the B-21 long-range strike family of systems. 3. Increase Air Force airlift and aerial refueling capacity to support agile combat employment operations that generate combat sorties from a highly dispersed posture in both Europe and the Pacific. 4. Develop and buy larger quantities of advanced mid-range weapons, 50 nanometers to 200 nanometers, that are sized to maximize targets per sortie for stealth aircraft flying in contested environments against target sets that could exceed 100,000 aim points. 5. Accelerate the development and production of the Sentinel intercontinental ballistic missile to reduce the risk inherent in an aging Minuteman III force in light of China's nuclear modernization breakout. 6. Increase the number of EC-37B electronic warfare aircraft from 10 to 20 in order to achieve a minimum capacity to engage growing threats from China across the electromagnetic spectrum. Invest in future Air Force programs and efforts. Increasingly capable adversaries require new capabilities to enable victory against those adversaries. 1. Attain an operationally optimized advanced battle management system as the Air Force element of the DoD Joint All-Domain Command and Control Enterprise. 2. Produce the next-generation air dominance system of systems, air-moving target indication, other sensors, communications, command and control, weapons, and uninhabited aerial vehicles. 3. Achieve moving target engagement capability and capacity against sea, surface, and ground mobile targets at the scale necessary to meet the needs of the National Defense Strategy. 4. Build resilient basing, sustainment, and communications for survivability in a contested environment. 5. Establish a vigorous and sufficiently funded electromagnetic spectrum operations recovery plan to make up for more than 20 years of neglect of this mission area. U.S. Marine Corps. The U.S. Marine Corps, USMC, is the maritime land force of the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy. It serves a critical role as an expeditionary amphibious force that can project power from sea to shore and beyond while performing other specialized missions like securing America's diplomatic outposts abroad. Between the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and the conclusion of U.S. military operations in Afghanistan in August 2022, the Marine Corps engaged in extended operations ashore as directed by the Secretary of Defense, leaving it with little opportunity or ability to train for and execute the naval and amphibious operations for which it is uniquely suited and directed by law. This lengthy divergence from its primary mission led to deep concern that the Corps had become a second land army, prompting senior Marine Corps leaders to push for the service to return to the sea. In addition, the USMC spent nearly 2 decades fighting counterinsurgency wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and developed capabilities that were specifically geared to those fights, but have limited utility in scenarios involving evenly matched and advanced enemies, or amphibious operations that are necessary for the projection of naval power. As a result, Marine Corps Commandant General David H. Berger developed and began to implement Force Design 2030-31, a plan that, if completed, would be the most radical transformation of the Marine Corps since World War II. The successful implementation of this force redesign, coupled with reforms in the Marine Corps' personnel system and the Navy's amphibious shipbuilding plans, will be critical to ensuring the Corps' future combat effectiveness. Needed reforms. Divest systems to implement the Force Design 2030 transformation. Divesting equipment that is less relevant to distributed, low-signature operations in a contested maritime environment will make funds available for modernization. 1. Transform USMC force structure. A. Eliminate all USMC law enforcement battalions. B. Transform at least one Marine infantry regiment into a Marine littoral regiment. C. Reduce the size of remaining infantry battalions. 2. Divest systems or equipment that are better suited to heavier U.S. Army units. A. Maintain divestment of M1 Abrams tanks. B. Eliminate the majority of tube artillery, M777, batteries. C. Reduce the number of advanced amphibious assault vehicles and the number of their replacements. 3. Use funds made available by divestment of systems to support new systems that are geared to the likely needs of future conflicts. A. Increase the number of rocket artillery batteries, HIMARS. B. Increase the number of upgraded light armored vehicle, LAV companies. C. Increase the number of unmanned aerial systems and anti-air systems, including counter-US systems. D. Develop long-range strike missiles and anti-ship missiles for the Corps. E. Modernize USMC infantry equipment. Transform the USMC personnel paradigm. More than other services, the USMC relies heavily on junior non-commissioned officers, NCOs, to staff key positions across the force, but especially in combat arms. For example, E4s routinely hold squad leader billets when the Army normally has ESXS in those billets. The nature of more distributed operations and the increasingly complex responsibilities of a Marine Corps rifle squad and platoon under Force Design 2030 will only put more responsibility on the backs of squad leaders and platoon sergeants, increasing the need for more senior Marines in those critical positions. Additionally, the Corps needs to improve its retention of junior NCOs after their first enlistments. The Marines have much lower rates of reenlistment than other branches. 1. Align the USMC's combat arms rank structure with the U.S. Army's. Squad leader billets are for ESXS, and platoon sergeant billets are for E7s. 2. Create better incentives to retain talented junior NCOs, especially in infantry and other critical military occupational specialties. 3. Reduce unnecessary deployments to increase dwell time in order to enable more robust primary military education. Align Navy amphibious shipbuilding with Force Design 2030. The U.S. Navy has struggled for decades to maintain an amphibious fleet that could support USMC war plans around large-scale amphibious operations. In addition, amphibious shipbuilding has often had to compete against other priorities within a constrained budget and limited shipbuilding capacity. 1. Develop and produce light amphibious warships, LAWs, to support more distributed amphibious operations, especially in the Pacific. 2. Maintain between 28 and 31 larger amphibious warships as opposed to the 25 specified in current Navy shipbuilding plans and the 38 specified before 2020. U.S. Space Force. U.S. Space Forces conduct global space operations to sustain and enhance air, land, and sea effectiveness, lethality, and superiority by providing secure broadband global communications, precision position, navigation, and timing accuracy, attack warning and threat tracking and targeting capability, real-time intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance information, and their assured continuity of operations both by defending U.S. assets and by conducting offensive operations that are capable of imposing unacceptable losses on adversaries that might seek to attack them. The U.S. Space Force, USSF, was established to assure continuous global and theater combat support from space, to deter attacks against U.S. space assets, and to prevail in space should deterrence fail. The USSF posture was conceived as a balance of offensive and defensive deterrent capabilities designed for maximum effectiveness. Needed reforms. Reverse the Biden administration's defensive posture. The Biden administration has eliminated almost all offensive deterrence capabilities and instead will rely solely on defensive capabilities of disaggregation, maneuver, and reconstitution, the most costly, the slowest, and ultimately the most fragile architecture selection. 1. Re-establish offensive capabilities to guarantee a favorable balance of forces, efficiently manage the full deterrence spectrum, and seriously complicate enemy calculations of a successful first strike against U.S. space assets. 2. Restore architectural balance in U.S. Space Forces, both offensive and defensive, to restore deterrence dominance efficiently and quickly. 3. Rapidly expand space control capability to include cislunar space, the region beginning at geosynchronous altitude and encompassing the Moon, to provide early warning of an enemy attack. 4. Seek arms control and rules of the road, understandings only when they are unambiguously in the interests of the U.S. and its allies, and prohibit their unilateral implementation. Reduce overclassification. The USSF must move beyond the Cold War-era culture of secrecy and overclassification that surrounded military space to facilitate greater coordination and synchronization of efforts across the government and commercial sectors. Declassify appropriate information about terrestrial and on-orbit space capabilities that threaten the U.S. space constellation, as well as those being pursued by our competitors, to secure the principled right to counter them offensively. Implement policies suited to a mature USSF. No longer a newborn, the USSF has entered its 4th year of existence, and the lessons learned can be incorporated across all facets of the force to increase its effectiveness. 1. Restructure from the current unity of effort structure to unity of command. 2. Lead the U.S. government's development of a clear and unambiguous declaratory policy that the United States will operate at will in space and enforce these operations with capabilities that ensure effective deterrence and the ability to impose our will if necessary. 3. End the current study phase of concept development and issue necessary guidance for the development and fielding of offensive capabilities. 4. Alter the Space Development Agency's current, fail early, approach and transition to a methodology that maintains aggressive timelines, but with significantly greater engineering rigor, with special attention to sustainment, support, and fully integrated space operations. 5. Increase the number of general officer positions to ensure the Space Force's ability to compete for resources on a common basis with the other services. 6. Explore creation of a Space Force Academy to attract top aero, astro students, engineers, and scientists and develop astronauts. The academy could be attached initially to a large existing research university like the California Institute of Technology or MIT, share faculty and funding, and eventually be built separately to be on par with the other service academies. U.S. Cyber Command. A cybercom was established in 2010 by the Department of Defense to unify the direction of cyberspace operations, strengthen DoD cyberspace capabilities, and integrate and enhance U.S. cyber expertise. Cyber capabilities and threats are evolving rapidly. Accordingly, a conservative administration should be especially sensitive to and prepared to meet the challenges presented by bureaucratic silos, inappropriately rigid tactical doctrine, and strategic thinking's historic tendency to lag behind technological capability. The preliminary evidence from the war in Ukraine suggests that existing cyber doctrine and certain capability and target assumptions may be incorrect or misplaced. The following recommendations therefore presuppose that there will be a rigorous lessons learned, analysis and review of existing U.S. doctrine in light of the battlefield evidence. Needed reforms ensure that a cybercom is properly focused. Mission creep is leading to wasteful overlap with the Department of Homeland Security, National Security Agency, Department of Defense, and Central Intelligence Agency. 1. Separate a cybercom from the National Security Agency per congressional direction. 2. Conduct effective offensive cyber effects operations at the tactical and strategic levels. 3. Expand defensive cyber effects operations authorized by President Trump's classified National Security Presidential Memorandum 13, United States Cyber Operations Policy, 36-4. End a cybercom's participation in federal efforts to fortify U.S. elections to eliminate the perception that DoD is engaging in partisan politics. Increase a cybercom's effectiveness. 1. Accelerate the integration of cyber and electronic warfare, EW, doctrine and capabilities, abiding by the time-tested norms of combined arms warfare. 2. Mandate that development teams will include both coders and soldiers, aircrew, and sailors with kinetic experience at the platoon level. 3. Break the paradigm of cyber authorities held at the strategic level. 4. Increase cyber resilience by, for example, protecting the Nuclear Command, Control, and Communications Network and the Air Force's Cyber Resiliency Office for Weapons Systems, CROWS. 5. Expand coordination of joint operations with allies. 6. Implement the Government Accountability Office's recommendation that the DoD Chief Information Officer, Commander of a Cybercom, and Commander of Joint Force Headquarters, DoD Information Network, align policy and system requirements to enable DoD to have enterprise-wide visibility of cyber incident reporting to support tactical, strategic, and military strategies for response. 37. Rationalize strategy and doctrine. 1. Update the October 2022 National Security Strategy to define DoD roles and responsibilities beyond existing platitudes. 2. Apply traditional deterrence strategies and principles for using cyber/EW in retaliation for foreign cyber attacks and/or EW actions against U.S. infrastructure and citizens. Special Operations Forces. Even though America's conventional war in Afghanistan was a failure, Special Operations Forces of the United States Special Operation Command, USCIS, executed an extremely effective counterterrorism campaign. There has not been another major attack on the homeland. Global terrorist threats are reduced and managed, collaboration with international partners is effective, and units under USCIS are the most capable and experienced warfighters in 2 generations. There is a movement to reduce the scope and scale of USCIS's mission in favor of other service priorities in great power competition. This would be a mistake because USCIS can be employed effectively in great power competition. It makes sense to capitalize on USCIS's experience and repurpose its mission to include irregular warfare within the context of great power competition, thereby providing a robust organization that is capable of achieving strategic effects that are critical both to our national defense and to the defense of our allies and partners around the globe. Irregular warfare should be used proactively to prevent state and non-state actors from negatively affecting U.S. policies and objectives while simultaneously strengthening our regional partnerships. If we maintain irregular warfare's traditional focus on non-state actors, we limit ourselves to addressing only the symptoms, non-state actors, not the problems themselves, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Needed reforms. Make irregular warfare a cornerstone of security strategy. The U.S. can project strength through unified action with our interagency, 38 allies and partners by utilizing irregular warfare capabilities synchronized with elements of national power. Broadly redefining irregular warfare to address current state and non-state actors is critical to countering irregular threats that range from the Chinese use of economic warfare to Russian disinformation and Islamist terrorism. A broad definition of irregular warfare in the national security strategy would allow for a whole-of government approach, thereby providing resources and capabilities to counter threats and ultimately serve as credible deterrence at the strategic and tactical levels. 1. Define irregular warfare as a means by which the United States uses all elements of national power to project influence abroad to counter state adversaries, defeat hostile non-state actors, deter wider conflict, and maintain peace in great power competition. 2. Characterize the state and non-state irregular threats facing the U.S. by region in the national security strategy. 3. Direct that irregular warfare resources, capabilities, and strategies be incorporated directly into the overall national defense strategy instead of being relegated to a supporting document. 4. Establish an irregular warfare center of excellence to help DoD train, equip, and organize to conduct irregular warfare as a core competency across the spectrum of competition, crisis, and conflict. Counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, globally. DoD, in conjunction with the interagency, allies, and partner nations, must work proactively to counter China's BRI around the globe. 1. Task USCIS and corresponding organizations in the Pentagon with conceptualizing, resourcing, and executing regionally based operations to counter the BRI with a focus on nations that are key to our energy policy, international supply chains, and our defense industrial base. 2. Use regional and global information operations to highlight Chinese violations of exclusive economic zones, violations of human rights, and coercion along Chinese fault lines in Xinjiang Province, Hong Kong, and Taiwan in addition to China's weaponization of sovereign debt. 3. In Xinjiang Province, Hong Kong, and Taiwan in addition to China's weaponization of sovereign debt. 3. Directly counter Chinese economic power with all elements of national power in North America, Central America, and the Caribbean to maintain maritime freedom of movement and protect the digital infrastructure of nations in the region. Establish credible deterrence through irregular warfare to protect the homeland. A whole-of-government approach and willingness to employ cyber, information, economic, and counter-terrorist irregular warfare capabilities should be utilized to protect the homeland. 1. Include the designation of USCIS as lead for the execution of irregular warfare against hostile state and non-state actors in the national defense strategy. 2. Demonstrate a willingness to employ offensive cyber capabilities against adversaries who conduct cyber attacks against U.S. infrastructure, businesses, personnel, and governments. 3. Employ a name and shame approach by making information regarding the names of entities that target democratic processes and international norms available in a transparent manner. 4. Work with the interagency to employ economic warfare, lawfare, and diplomatic pressure against hostile state and non-state actors. 5. Maintain the authorities necessary for an aggressive counterterrorism posture against threats to the homeland. Nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence is one of the most critical elements of U.S. national security, as it forms a backstop to U.S. military forces. Every operational plan relies on the assumption that nuclear deterrence holds. Ever since the U.S. first acquired nuclear weapons, administrations of both parties have pursued a strategy designed to deter nuclear and non-nuclear attack, assure allies, and, in the event of nuclear employment, restore deterrence at the lowest possible cost to the U.S. Today, however, America's ability to meet these goals is increasingly challenged by the growing nuclear threats posed by our adversaries. China is pursuing a strategic breakout of its nuclear forces, significantly shifting the nuclear balance and forcing the U.S. to learn how to deter two nuclear peer competitors, China and Russia, simultaneously for the first time in its history. Russia is expanding its nuclear arsenal and using the threat of nuclear employment as a coercive tactic in its war on Ukraine. North Korea is advancing its nuclear capabilities. Iran is inching closer to nuclear capability. Meanwhile, all U.S. nuclear capabilities and the infrastructure on which they rely date from the Cold War and are in dire need of replacement. The next administration will need to focus on continuing the effort to modernize the nuclear triad while updating our strategy and capabilities to meet the challenges presented by a more threatening nuclear environment. Needed reforms. Prioritize nuclear modernization. All components of the nuclear triad are far beyond their intended lifetimes and will need to be replaced over the next decade. This effort is required for the U.S. to maintain its nuclear triad and will be the bare minimum needed to maintain U.S. strategic nuclear deterrence. 1. Accelerate the timelines of critical modernization programs including the Sentinel missile, long-range standoff weapon, LRESO, Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine, B-21 bomber, and F-35 dual-capable aircraft. 2. Reject any congressional proposals that would further extend the service lives of U.S. capabilities, such as the Minuteman III ICBM. 3. Ensure sufficient funding for Warhead Life Extension Programs, LEP, including the B-61-12, W-80-4, W-87-1 Mod, and W-88 Alt 370. develop the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile Nuclear, SLCMN. In 2018, the Trump administration proposed restoring the SLCMN to help fill a growing gap in U.S. non-strategic capabilities and improve deterrence against limited nuclear attack. The Biden administration canceled this program in its 2022 Nuclear Posture Review, NPR. The next president should support and accelerate funding for development of the SLCMN with the goal of deployment by the end of the decade. Account for China's nuclear expansion. To ensure its ability to deter both Russia and the growing Chinese nuclear threat, the U.S. will need more than the bare minimum of nuclear modernization. President Biden's 2022 NPR described the problem, but proposed no recommendations to restore or maintain nuclear deterrence. 1. Consider procuring more modernized nuclear systems, such as the Sentinel missile or LRESO, than currently planned. 2. Improve the ability of the U.S. to utilize the Triad's upload capacity in case of a crisis. 3. Review what capabilities in addition to the SLCMN, for example, non-strategic weapons or new warhead designs, are needed to deter the unique Chinese threat. Restore the nuclear infrastructure. The United States must restore its necessary nuclear infrastructure so that it is capable of producing and maintaining nuclear weapons. 1. Accelerate the effort to restore plutonium pit production, which is essential both for modern warhead programs and for recapitalizing the stockpile. 2. Continue to invest in rebuilding infrastructure, including facilities at the national laboratories that support nuclear weapons development. 3. Restore readiness to test nuclear weapons at the Nevada National Security Site to ensure the ability of the U.S. to respond quickly to asymmetric technology surprises. Correctly orient arms control. The U.S. should agree to arms control agreements only if they help to advance the interests of the U.S. and its allies. 1. Reject proposals for nuclear disarmament that are contrary to the goal of bolstering deterrence. 2. Pursue arms control as a way to secure the national security interests of the U.S. and its allies rather than as an end in itself. 3. Prepare to compete in order to secure U.S. interests should arms control efforts continue to fail. Missile defense. Missile defense is a critical component of the U.S. national security architecture. It can help to deter attack by instilling doubt that an attack will work as intended, take adversary, cheap shots off the table, and limit the perceived value of missiles as tools of coercion. It also allows space for diplomacy during a crisis and can protect U.S. and allied forces, critical assets, and populations if deterrence fails. Adversaries are relying increasingly on missiles to achieve their aims. China and Russia, in addition to their vast and growing ballistic missile inventories, are deploying new hypersonic glide vehicles and investing in new ground-launched, air-launched, and sea-launched cruise missiles that uniquely challenge the United States in different domains. North Korea has pursued an aggressive missile testing program and is becoming increasingly belligerent towards South Korea and Japan. Iran continues to maintain a missile arsenal that is capable of striking U.S. and allied assets in the Middle East and Europe, and its rocket launches demonstrate that it either has or is developing the ability to build ICBMs. Missile defense has been underprioritized and underfunded in recent years. In light of these growing threats, the incoming administration should treat missile defense as a top priority. Needed reforms. Champion the benefits of missile defense. Despite its deterrence and damage limitation benefits, opponents argue incorrectly that U.S. missile defense is destabilizing because it threatens Russian and Chinese second strike capabilities. 1. Reject claims made by the left that missile defense is destabilizing while acknowledging that Russia and China are developing their own advanced missile defense systems. 2. Commit to keeping homeland missile defense off the table in any arms control negotiations with Russia and China. Strengthen homeland ballistic missile defense. The United States currently deploys 44 ground-based interceptors, GBIs, as part of its ground-based mid-course defense, GMD, system to defend the homeland against North Korea, but as North Korea improves its missile program, this system is at risk of falling behind the threat. 1. By at least 64 of the next-generation interceptor, NGI, which is more advanced than the GBI, for an eventual uniform fleet of interceptors. The Biden administration currently plans to buy only 20. 2. Consider additional steps to strengthen the GMD system, such as a layered missile defense or a third interceptor site on the East Coast. Increase the development of regional missile defense. As the Ukraine conflict amply demonstrates, U.S. regional missile defense capabilities are very limited. The United States has been unable to supply our partners reliably with any capabilities, and the number and types of regional missile defense platforms are less than the U.S. needs for its own defense. The U.S. should prioritize procurement of more regional defense systems, such as Theater High Altitude Area Defense, THAAD, Standard Missile, 3, and Patriot missiles. Change U.S. missile defense policy. Historically, the U.S. has chosen to rely solely on deterrence to address the Russian and Chinese ballistic missile threat to the homeland and to use homeland missile defense only against rogue nations. 1. Abandon the existing policy of not defending the homeland against Russian and Chinese ballistic missiles and focus on how to improve defense as the Russian and Chinese missile threats increase at an unprecedented rate. 2. Invest in future advanced missile defense technologies like directed energy or space-based missile defense that could defend against more numerous missile threats. Invest in new track and intercept capabilities. The advent of hypersonic missiles and increased numbers of cruise missile arsenals by threat actors poses new challenges to our missile defense capabilities. 1. Invest in cruise missile defense of the homeland. 2. Accelerate the program to deploy space-based sensors that can detect and track missiles flying on non-ballistic trajectories. 3. Accelerate the glide phase interceptor, which is intended to counter hypersonic weapons. Page 133. Department of Homeland Security, Primary Recommendation. Our primary recommendation is that the President pursue legislation to dismantle the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. After 20 years, it has not gelled into one DHS. Instead, its various components' different missions have outweighed its decades-long attempt to function as one department, rendering the whole disjointed rather than cohesive. Breaking up the department along its mission lines would facilitate mission focus and provide opportunities to reduce overhead and achieve more limited government. In lieu of a status quo DHS, we recommend that U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, be combined with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, and the Department of Justice, DOJ, Executive Office for Immigration Review, ER, and Office of Immigration Litigation, OIL, into a standalone border and immigration agency at the cabinet level, more than 100,000 employees, making it the third largest department measured by manpower. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, be moved to the Department of Transportation. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, be moved to the Department of the Interior, or, if combined with CISA, to the Department of Transportation. The U.S. Coast Guard, USCG, be moved to DOJ and, in time of full-scale war, i.e., threatening the homeland, to the Department of Defense, DoD. Alternatively, USCG should be moved to DoD for all purposes. The U.S. Secret Service, USSS, be divided in two, with the protective element moved to DOJ and the financial enforcement element moved to the Department of the Treasury. The Transportation Security Administration, TSA, be privatized. The Science and Technology Directorate, SNT, be moved to DoD and the Office of Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction be moved to the FBI. All of the remaining supporting components could be dismantled because their functions already exist in the moving components as well as the receiving departments. Cutting these costs would save the American taxpayers significant sums. Unless and until this dismantling recommendation is pursued and achieved, however, DHS will statutorily continue to exist, and it needs many reforms. Accordingly, we now turn to recommended changes in DHS as it exists now. Mission Statement. The Department of Homeland Security protects the American homeland from and prepares for terrorism and other hazards in both the physical and cyber realms, provides for secure and free movement of trade and travel, and enforces U.S. immigration laws impartially. Overview. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, was created in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and subsequent mailings of anthrax spores. The Homeland Security Act of 2002, one which created the department, states that DHS's primary mission is to prevent terrorist attacks within the U.S., reduce the nation's vulnerability to terrorism, minimize the damage from and assist in the recovery from any terrorist attacks, prepare and respond to natural and man-made crises and emergencies, and monitor connections between illegal drug trafficking and terrorism. Coordinate efforts to sever such connections and interdict illegal drug trafficking. Unfortunately for our nation, the federal government's newest department became like every other federal agency, bloated, bureaucratic, and expensive. It also lost sight of its mission priorities. DHS has also suffered from the left's wokeness and weaponization against Americans whom the left perceives as its political opponents. To truly secure the homeland, a conservative administration needs to return the department to the right mission, the right size, and the right budget. This would include reorganizing the department and shifting significant resources away from several supporting components to the essential operational components. Prioritizing border security and immigration enforcement, including detention and deportation, is critical if we are to regain control of the border, repair the historic damage done by the Biden administration, return to a lawful and orderly immigration system, and protect the homeland from terrorism and public safety threats. This also includes consolidating the pieces of the fragmented immigration system into one agency to fulfill the mission more efficiently. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, is a DHS component that the left has weaponized to censor speech and affect elections at the expense of securing the cyber domain and critical infrastructure, which are threatened daily. A conservative administration should return CISA to its statutory and important but narrow mission. The bloated DHS bureaucracy and budget, along with the wrong priorities, provide real opportunities for a conservative administration to cut billions in spending and limit government's role in Americans' lives. These opportunities include privatizing TSA screening and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, National Flood Insurance Program. Reforming FEMA emergency spending to shift the majority of preparedness and response costs to states and localities instead of the federal government, eliminating most of DHS's grant programs, and removing all unions in the Department for National Security purposes. A successful DHS would secure and control the border, thoroughly enforce immigration laws, correctly and efficiently adjudicate immigration benefit applications while rejecting fraudulent claims, secure the cyber domain and collaborate with critical infrastructure sectors to maintain their security, provide states and localities with a limited federal emergency response and preparedness, secure our coasts and economic zones, protect political leaders, their families and visiting heads of state or government, and oversee transportation security. Office of the Secretary, SEC. In the next administration, the Office of the Secretary should take on the following key issues and challenges to ensure the effective operation of DHS. Expansion of dedicated political personnel. The Secretary of Homeland Security is a presidentially appointed and Senate-confirmed political appointee, but for budgetary reasons, he or she has historically been unable to fund a dedicated team of political appointees. A key first step for the Secretary to improve front office functions is to have his or her own dedicated team of political appointees selected and vetted by the Office of Presidential Personnel, which is not reliant on detailees from other parts of the department to help ensure the completion of the next president's agenda. An aggressive approach to Senate-confirmed leadership positions. While Senate confirmation is a constitutionally necessary requirement for appointing agency leadership, the next administration may need to take a novel approach to the confirmations process to ensure an adequate and rapid transition. For example, the next administration arguably should place its nominees for key positions into similar positions as actings, for example, putting in a person to serve as the senior official performing the duties of the commissioner of CBP while that person is going through the confirmation process to direct IC or become the secretary. This approach would both guarantee implementation of the Day 1 agenda and equip the department for potential emergency situations while still honoring the confirmation requirement. The department should also look to remove lower-level but nevertheless important positions that currently require Senate confirmation from the confirmation requirement, although this effort would require legislation, and might also be mooted in the event of legislation that closes portions of the department that currently have Senate-confirmed leadership. Clearer, more durable, and political-only line of succession. Based on previous experience, the department needs legislation to establish a more durable but politically oriented line of succession for agency decision-making purposes. Important positions that currently require Senate confirmation from the confirmation requirement, although this effort would require legislation, and might also be mooted in the event of legislation that closes portions of the department that currently have Senate-confirmed leadership. Clearer, more durable, and political-only line of succession. Based on previous experience, the department needs legislation to establish a more durable but politically oriented line of succession for agency decision-making purposes. The ideal sequence for line of succession is certainly debatable, except that in circumstances where a career employee holds a leadership position in the department, that position should be deemed vacant for line of succession purposes, and the next eligible political appointee in the sequence should assume acting authority. Further, individuals wielding acting secretary authority should have explicit authority to finalize agency actions, including regulations, to ensure that the department's Homeland Security mission is fulfilled. Soft closure of unnecessary offices. Pending a possible presidential decision to shrink or eliminate DHS itself, the next administration will still have the obligation to protect the homeland as required by law. The Secretary therefore can and should use his or her inherent, discretionary leadership authority to soft close ineffective and problematic corners of the department. While those corners are to be determined, the Secretary could shift personnel, funding, and operational responsibility to mission-essential components of the department, including the Office of the Secretary itself. This effort not only would make the department more efficient, but also would support a legislative move to shrink or dismantle the department by showing that the agency can fulfill national security critical functions without its current bloated bureaucracy. Restructuring and redistribution of career personnel. To strengthen political decision-making and ensure that taxpayer dollars are being used legally and efficiently, the Secretary should make major changes in the distribution of career personnel throughout the department. For example, personnel from parts of the department undergoing soft closure could be redistributed to what will be workload-intensive corners of the department, including national security, critical and transparency functions. All personnel with law enforcement capacity should be removed immediately from office billets and deployed to field billets to maximize law enforcement capacity. Compliance for grants and other federal funding. The next administration should take steps to restore lawfulness and integrity to the department's massive regimen of federal grant programs, most of which are managed and distributed by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The Secretary should direct FEMA to ensure that all FEMA-issued grant funding for states, localities, and private organizations is going to recipients who are lawful actors, can demonstrate that they are in compliance with federal law, and can show that their mission and actions support the broader Homeland Security mission. All applicants and potential recipients of such grant funding should be required to meet certain preconditions for eligibility, except for receipt of post-disaster or non-humanitarian funding, or should simply be considered ineligible for funding. Such preconditions should include at least the following: certification by applicants that they comply with all aspects of federal immigration laws, including the honoring of all immigration detainers. Certification by applicants that they are both registered with E-Verify and using E-Verify in a transparent and non-evasive manner. For states and localities, that would include certification that all components of that government, and not just the applicant agency, are registered with and use E-Verify. If the applicant is a state or locality, commitment by that state or locality to total information sharing in the context of both federal law enforcement and immigration enforcement. This would include access to Department of Motor Vehicles and voter registration databases. Non-use of discretionary guest worker visa authorities. To stop facilitating the availability of cheap foreign labor in order to support American workers, particularly poor and middle-class American workers, and follow congressional intent. The Secretary should explicitly cease using at least 2 discretionary authorities as part of his or her broader effort to support American workers. The Secretary should make it clear that he or she will not use the Secretary's existing discretionary authority to increase the number of H-2B, seasonal non-agricultural, visas above the statutorily set cap. The Secretary should not issue any regulations in support of the H-2 eligible country list, the effect of which would prevent favoring certain foreign nationals seeking an H-2 guest worker visa based simply on their nationality. Restoration of honesty and transparency. The Secretary should use his or her inherent authority as leader of the department to follow up with congressional and other partners to disclose information and provide the transparency that has been obstructed during the Biden administration. The Secretary should proceed from the assumption that congressional inquiries and public information requests were unfulfilled and then seek to fulfill them. Replacement of the entire Homeland Security Advisory Committee. The Secretary should plan to quickly remove all current members of the Homeland Security Advisory Committee and replace them as quickly as is feasible. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP. If all immigration agencies are not merged, including USCIS and ORR, then an appropriate third alternative would be to consolidate ICE and CBP to form a combined Border Security and Immigration Agency, BSIA. This would integrate critical interdiction, enforcement, and investigative resources, enhancing coordination and refocusing collective efforts on the vast and complex cross-border threats impacting our nation's health, safety, and national security. It would also simultaneously add efficiencies to our nation's capacity to facilitate lawful trade and travel. The BSIA should establish clear mission requirements, responsibilities, and mandates under existing law regarding the persistent need for and utilization of U.S. military personnel and resources to assist BSIA with increasing whole-of-government efforts and long-term strategy to secure our nation's borders effectively. In addition, appropriate elements within the newly created BSIA should be designated as part of the U.S. national security and intelligence community. A conservative administration should eliminate any prohibitive guidance, direction, or mandate from DHS or the administration that curtails or limits CBP from publishing detailed border security and enforcement data not impacting intelligence, interdiction, and investigative operations, methods, or sources. DHS should issue a regulation mandating that CBP publish accurate and timely border security data, readily available to the public, on a regular basis that avoid White House and DHS leadership review and approval. The White House should grant the authority for CBP and DHS executives to utilize component aviation assets under the Office of Air and Marine, OM. CBP and DHS have worldwide missions with personnel and facilities that are deployed across the globe and in every state in the U.S. With a CBP workforce alone of more than 60,000 people, 240,000 plus for DHS, encompassing more than 1,000 sea, land, and airports, it is essential that the Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, Secretary, and Deputy Secretary can travel efficiently to facilities to maintain appropriate situational awareness across the department's vast mission set and interact with the expansive workforce. Although CBP operates one of the largest aviation components of any domestic U.S. law enforcement agency, executives are prohibited from utilizing the agency's aviation assets to facilitate official travel. Executives are required to fly on commercial airlines, and this requirement significantly limits their ability to have classified communications and takes them offline for extended periods of time. Border Patrol, BP, and OM should be combined within CBP. BP has more than 20,000 personnel, and OM has approximately 1,800. OM's assets are dedicated in support of BP operations the vast majority of the time, yet redundant approvals, strategies, and independent hierarchical commands serve as impediments to efficient and practical resource deployments. CBP should restart and expand use of the horseback-mounted Border Patrol. As part of this announcement, the Secretary should clear the records and personnel files of those who were falsely accused by Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas of whipping migrants and issue a formal apology on behalf of DHS and CBP. The Secretary should combine the Office of Trade, OT, and Trade Relations with the Office of Field Operations, OFO. The OT is the smallest of CBP's components, and its operational counterpart, OFO, has a workforce of more than 30,000. OT's function is interwoven with that of its OFO operational counterpart. Combining OT with OFO would achieve streamlined operations and increase OT's capacity and capability by leveraging OFO's expansive resources. CBP, ICE, and USCIS all have authority to issue notices to appear, NTA, to removable aliens in their presence, which begins removal proceedings. In most instances, CBP should turn illegal aliens over to ICE for detention, and ICE can then issue any needed NTA. CBP should issue NTAs only in limited situations for humanitarian reasons, such as medical emergencies. In addition, CBP should eliminate use of notices to report, NTR, altogether. CBP's established national standards of transport, escort, detention, and search, TEDS, have been widely interpreted and expanded by lower courts. This has resulted in unrealistic and differing detention standards for CBP facilities based on the jurisdiction within which they fall, negatively impacting operations. ICE has suffered similarly. A single nationwide detention standard should be codified that prevents individual states from mandating that federal government agencies adhere to widely expansive and ever-changing sets of standards. Such standards should allow the flexibility to use large numbers of temporary facilities such as tents. The annual costs associated with establishing and maintaining temporary facilities to address the flow of illegal migration and associated care, transportation, and processing are prohibitive, and CBP's budget is inadequate. CBP is forced to forego critical mission essential endeavors to fund the additional associated costs. Often, this requires the reprogramming of funding at the DHS level, which has a negative impact on other DHS components operations. This predictable cost that has to be paid from existing CBP and DHS funding levels reduces CBP's operational readiness and ability to accomplish its diverse and critical missions to protect the American people. The next president should request a realistic budget that fully pays for these costs. Increased funding is needed for BP to hire additional support personnel, which would relieve uniformed BP agents from administrative duties associated with processing aliens and allow them to return to their national security mission. Congress should increase funding for facility upgrades at strategic land ports of entry, PEs, including expanding state-of-the-art technology such as non-intrusive inspection equipment. Today, the cartels exploit the aging facilities and lack of adequate technology to smuggle illicit drugs, contraband, and more successfully through our nation's POEs. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. Needed reforms. Since the formation of DHS, ICE has increasingly been tasked with auxiliary missions that have little or nothing to do with either immigration or customs enforcement. To return ICE to its primary mission, any new administration that wishes to restore the rule of law to our immigration enforcement efforts should order ICE to stop closing out pending immigration cases and apply the Immigration and Nationality Act, INA, as written by Congress. The Biden administration closed out tens of thousands of immigration cases that had already been prepared and were slated for expedited removal processing or hearings before the U.S. Immigration Court. This misguided action constituted an egregious example of lawlessness that allowed thousands of illegal aliens and other immigration violators to go free in the United States. Direct ICE to stop ignoring criminal aliens identified through the 287G program. Ultimately, Congress should prevent ICE from ignoring criminal aliens identified by local law enforcement agencies that are partners in the 287G program. However, before congressional action, ICE should be directed to take custody of all aliens with records for felonies, crimes of violence, DUIs, previous removals, and any other crime that is considered a national security or public safety threat as defined under current laws. Eliminate T and U visas. Victimization should not be a basis for an immigration benefit. If an alien who is a trafficking or crime victim is actively and significantly cooperating with law enforcement as a witness, the S visa is already available and should be used. Pending elimination of the T and U visas, the Secretary should significantly restrict eligibility for each visa to prevent fraud. Issue clear guidance regarding detention and bond for aliens. Thousands of illegal aliens are allowed to bond out of immigration detention only to disappear into the interior of the United States, where many commit crimes and many others disappear, never to be heard from again. This occurs primarily because of poorly worded bond regulations, contradictory bond policy memoranda, and poor practices for managing released aliens and the Alternatives to Detention (ATD) program, which requires significant reform. Prioritize national security in the Student and Exchange Visitor Program, SEVP. ICE should end its current cozy deference to educational institutions and remove security risks from the program. This requires working with the Department of State to eliminate or significantly reduce the number of visas issued to foreign students from enemy nations. Most of the foregoing can be accomplished rapidly and effectively through executive action that is both lawful and appropriate. Additionally, ICE should clarify who is responsible for enforcing its criminal and civil authorities. It should also remove self-imposed limitations on its nationwide jurisdiction. Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, special agents in the 1811 series should enforce Title 8 and 18 crimes as the biggest part of their portfolio. Alien smuggling, trafficking, and cross-border crime as defined under Title 85 and Title 186 should be the focus of IC operations. The role of IC deportation officers should be clarified. ICE enforcement and removal operations (ERO) should be identified as being primarily responsible for enforcing civil immigration regulations, including the civil arrest, detention, and removal of immigration violators anywhere in the United States, without warrant where appropriate, subject only to the civil warrant requirements of the INA where appropriate. All IC memoranda identifying sensitive zones where IC personnel are prohibited from operating should be rescinded. Rely on the good judgment of officers in the field to avoid inappropriate situations. To maximize the efficient use of its resources, ICE should make full use of existing expedited removal (ER) authorities. The agency has limited the use of ER to eligible aliens apprehended within 100 miles of the border. This is not a statutory requirement. New policies' U.S. national security and public safety interests would be well served if ICE were to be combined with CBP and USCIS, as mentioned above. Additionally, IC/HSI, along with CBP, should be full participants in the intelligence community. The use of Blackie's warrants should be operationalized within IC. These civil search warrants are commonly used for worksite enforcement when agents have probable cause that illegal aliens are employed at a business. This would streamline investigations. Safeguarding Americans will require not just securing the border, but continuous vetting and investigations of many aliens who exploited President Biden's open border for potentially nefarious purposes, including some Afghan evacuees sent directly to the U.S. during America's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Budget. Congress should mandate and fund additional bed space for alien detainees. ICE should be funded for a significant increase in detention space, raising the daily available number of beds to 100,000. Congress should fund IC for at least 20,000 ERO officers and 5,000 Office of the Principal Legal Advisor, OPLA, attorneys. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, is the agency tasked with administering the legal immigration and certain temporary visa programs. Needed reforms. Since January 2021, USCIS's priorities have been misaligned, and this has transformed it into an open borders agency, ignoring the critical role that it plays in national security, public safety, and safeguarding the integrity of our immigration system. USCIS should be returned to operating as a screening and vetting agency. Regulatory efforts have focused on easing asylum eligibility in a manner that is guaranteed to exacerbate asylum fraud as people surge at the border. Emphasis also has been placed on removing legal barriers to immigration, such as the use of public benefits. These actions violate statutes, erode congressional intent, and provide a significant magnet for continued illegal immigration. Additionally, USCIS resources have been misappropriated to focus more on creating and expanding large-scale parole and temporary status programs that violate the law and are otherwise contrary to congressional intent, instead of focusing on a more secure and efficient process for those who are seeking benefits. The ever-increasing number of applications filed has made it difficult to vet applications adequately for eligibility, fraud, and specific national security and public safety problems. The Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate, FD&S, is currently a small directorate with assigned officers reporting through the chain of command in the field, and this has led to stovepiping, lack of coordination in national policy, and inconsistencies throughout the agency. To prioritize vetting and fraud detection, FD&S should undergo a structural shift focused on direct reporting from the field to headquarters, reclassification of leadership, and FD&S directives taking precedence over those of other component entities. Correcting the current misalignment of agency priorities and resources should begin with this primary shift in focus to vetting and fraud detection. These actions would reform the agency, returning it to its screening and vetting mission in protecting the homeland. Difficult to vet applications adequately for eligibility, fraud, and specific national security and public safety problems. The Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate, FD&S, is currently a small directorate with assigned officers reporting through the chain of command in the field, and this has led to stovepiping, lack of coordination in national policy, and inconsistencies throughout the agency. To prioritize vetting and fraud detection, FD&S should undergo a structural shift focused on direct reporting from the field to headquarters, reclassification of leadership, and FD&S directives taking precedence over those of other component entities. Correcting the current misalignment of agency priorities and resources should begin with this primary shift in focus to vetting and fraud detection. These actions would reform the agency, returning it to its screening and vetting mission in protecting the homeland. Other structural changes should include reimplementation of the USCIS Denaturalization Unit, an effort to maintain integrity in the system by identifying and prosecuting criminal and civil denaturalization cases, in combination with the Department of Justice, for aliens who obtained citizenship through fraud or other illicit means. Additionally, USCIS should create a criminal enforcement component within the agency to investigate immigration benefits fraud under Title VIII, perhaps requiring additional legislative and regulatory authorities for the officers themselves, and to prosecute cases through Special Assistant U.S. Attorneys, SAUSs, with substantive knowledge in the field. Particular attention should be given to addressing increasing incidents of forced labor trafficking in temporary work visa programs. While the Biden regulatory agenda has focused on at least two major rules, the credible fear rule and the public charge rule, USCIS has utilized other policy and internal procedural mechanisms to extend employment authorization to large groups of people who are in the country without legal status. Cs, memoranda, and management directives issued during the Biden administration should be completed, and rescission documents should be prepared for issuance within the first few days of the incoming administration. Additionally, regulatory documents should be drafted to review or reverse all regulations promulgated during the Biden administration. New policies to advance the national interest, the three core immigration agencies, USCIS, ICE, and CBP, should remerge and have immigration elements outside of DHS, such as OR of HHS, included. The fragmented immigration enforcement framework that developed in the wake of the Homeland Security Act has weakened each agency and should be remediated. Combining these critical agencies would strengthen their capabilities, ensure cooperation, and promote information sharing. Agency responsibilities and the delineation of authorities, such as inconsistent use of deferred action and issuance of NTAs by each agency, have long been a point of contention that would be addressed much more easily if they were recombined into a single entity. Alternatively, new policies for USCIS as it currently exists should focus on matters that can be addressed through administrative action. The workforce should be realigned and, as necessary, retrained on base eligibility and fraud detection rather than speed in processing. Training should be returned to Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers, FLEC, which would underscore the enforcement role of USCIS as a vetting agency and be rebranded accordingly. Management directives and policies should realign to ensure that the workforce, while adaptable and able to handle the bulk of the USCIS mission, is not allowed to be pulled off mission work to focus on unlawful programs, DACA, mass parole for Afghans, Ukrainians, Venezuelans, etc., which divert resources away from nuclear family and Authorization reform rules, asylum bars rule, and a third country transit rule. At a minimum, an enhanced regulatory agenda should include rules strengthening the integrity of the asylum system, parole reform, and visa reform that prioritizes relief for victims of heinous crimes and ensures that we protect the truest and most deserving victims of crime. Not all policy changes require formal rulemaking, however, as internal guidance documents are generally exempt under the Administrative Procedure Act, APA. In this sub-regulatory space, USCIS policy memos and operational guidance should reduce the validity of employment authorization documents and end the COVID flexibilities, including the reliance on biometrics reuse. USCIS should also enforce existing regulations by rejecting incomplete applications and petitions, ensuring both that they are completed before accepted for filing and that FDNS signs off on all approved applications and petitions before approval notices are sent to the alien or petitioner. Other efforts should be focused on adjudication standards returning to nearly 100% interview requirements for all appropriate cases. The incoming administration should spearhead an immigration legislative agenda focused on creating a merit-based immigration system that rewards high-skilled aliens instead of the current system that favors extended family-based and luck-of-the-draw immigration. To that end, the diversity visa lottery should be repealed, chain migration should be ended while focusing on the nuclear family, and the existing employment visa program should be replaced with a system to award visas only to the best and brightest. Internal efforts to limit employment authorization should be matched by congressional action to narrow statutory eligibility to work in the United States and mitigate unfair employment competition for U.S. citizens. The oft-abused H-1B program should be transformed into an elite program through which employers are vying to bring in only the top foreign workers at the highest wages so as not to depress American opportunities. Additionally, Congress should improve the integrity of the temporary work visa programs, repeal temporary protected status, TPS, designations, permanently authorize and make mandatory e-verify, and end parole abuse by legislating specific parole standards. USCIS should make it clear that where no court jurisdiction exists, it will not honor court decisions that seek to undermine regulatory and sub-regulatory efforts. Finally, USCIS still requires access to all relevant national security and law enforcement databases in the same vein as any other agency in the intelligence space. This is a key concept that should be addressed as USCIS is returned to functioning primarily as a vetting agency. Budget USCIS is primarily fee-funded, operating on revenue derived by those who are seeking immigration benefits, work permits, and naturalization. The total agency budget requested for fiscal year FY 2023, including both fees and a small appropriation, is slightly less than $6 billion. The bulk of funds are derived from application fees through the Immigrant Examinations Fee account. As a general principle, adjudication of applications and petitions should be paid by applicants, not American taxpayers. It is critical that any changes in the budget, even in the wake of a realigned agency combined with IC and CBP, should retain a fee-funded model. Given the Obama and Biden administration's lack of will, fees should be increased agency-wide to keep in step with inflation and the true cost of the adjudications. The incoming administration should immediately submit a fee rule that reflects such an increase. Aside from an increase in all fees, the rule should drastically limit the availability for fee waivers and should implement a fee for asylum applications. Additionally, Congress should allow for a 10% across-the-board increase in all fees for all fee rules to account for the fact that new fee rules always lag behind budget requirements. USCIS should strive to increase opportunities for premium processing, a benefit by which applicants can expedite their processing times. While this places time burdens on adjudicators, it provides an opportunity for a significant influx of money into the agency, which is not currently available. While simply raising fees to the necessary levels to make the agency run efficiently would be preferable, without the need for expanded premium processing, this short-term measure should be utilized, particularly if longer-term fee rules are unsuccessful. At least until USCIS is caught up on all case backlogs, all applicants rejected for any benefit or status adjudication should be required to leave the U.S. immediately. Ordinary process can resume once all case backlogs have been adjudicated. Finally, USCIS should pause the intake of applications in a benefit category when backlogs in that category become excessive. Once USCIS adjudicators can decrease that caseload to a manageable number, application intake should resume. Personnel, USCIS should be classified as a national security, sensitive agency, and all of its employees should be classified as holding national security, sensitive positions. Leaks must be investigated and punished as they would be in a national security agency, and the union should be decertified. Any employees who cannot accept that change and cannot conform their behavior to the standards required by such an agency should be separated. USCIS's DC personnel presence should be skeletal, and agency employees with operational or security roles should be rotated out to offices throughout the United States. These USCIS employees should live and work in the communities that are most affected by their daily duties and decisions. Necessary border and immigration statutory, regulatory, and administrative changes. The current border security crisis was made possible by glaring loopholes in our immigration system. The result was a preventable and predictable historic increase in illegal and inadmissible encounters along our southern border. This pulled limited resources from the front lines of our nation's borders and away from their national security mission, releasing a vast and complex set of threats into our country. To regain our sovereignty, integrity, and security, Congress must pass meaningful legislation to close the current loopholes and prevent future administrations from exploiting them for political gain or personal ideology. Legislative proposals. Title 42 Authority and Title 8. Create an authority akin to the Title 42 Public Health Authority that has been used during the COVID-19 pandemic to expel illegal aliens across the border immediately when certain non-health conditions are met, such as loss of operational control of the border. Mandatory appropriation for border wall system infrastructure. The monies appropriated would be used to fund the construction of additional border wall systems, technology, and personnel in strategic locations in accordance with the Border Security Improvement Plan, BSIP. Appropriation for port of entry infrastructure. Border security is not addressed solely by systems in between the ports of entry. POEs require technology and physical upgrades as well as an influx of personnel to meet capacity demands and act as the literal gatekeepers for the country. This is the first line of defense against drug and human smuggling operations. Unaccompanied minors 1. Congress should repeal Section 235 of the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008, TVPRA. 9, which provides numerous immigration benefits to unaccompanied alien children and only encourages more parents to send their children across the border illegally and unaccompanied. These children too often become trafficking victims, which means that the TVPRA has failed. 2. If an alternative to repealing Section 235 of the TVPRA is necessary, the section should be amended so that all unaccompanied children, regardless of nationality, may be returned to their home countries in a safe and efficient manner. Currently, the TVPRA allows only children from contiguous countries, Canada and Mexico, to be returned while every other unaccompanied minor must be placed into a lengthy process that usually results in the minors landing in the custody of an illegal alien family member. 3. Congress must end the Flores Settlement Agreement by explicitly setting nationwide terms and standards for family and unaccompanied detention and housing. Such standards should focus on meeting human needs and should allow for large-scale use of temporary facilities, for example, tents. 4. Congress should amend the Homeland Security Act and portions of the TVPRA to move detention of alien children expressly from the Department of Health and Human Services to DHS. Asylum Reform 1. The standard